At my daughter's housewarming, she didn't let me pass the doorstep and said, "Take a look from the hallway, my husband didn't invite you." She didn't notice the gift in my hand. I turned around and called a taxi. But when her husband found out what was in that box, he packed his things and left her that very night. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you're listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. I was proud of my daughter, Allison. Proud in a way that carried the weight of decades, a slow, steady accumulation of joys, worries, and small triumphs. At 38, she had finally stepped into the home she had dreamed about for years, an elegant, sunlit place with wide windows that framed the garden she had imagined since childhood, a house that carried both promise and permanence. I had spent weeks preparing a gift, not a mere object but a vessel of memory, carefully choosing a delicate antique music box that had belonged to my mother. Its tiny, polished surface held the warmth of decades, its intricate inlays whispered of skillful hands and quiet devotion, and when wound, its soft, melodic chimes spoke of love preserved, of generations entwined. I imagined Allison holding it, feeling that same bridge between past and present, the way I had when I first cradled it as a child listening to my mother hum the tune it played. It was a piece of our family's heartbeat, and I had wrapped it with care, tied the ribbon into a neat bow, and breathed a small prayer that she would understand the depth of the gift. Driving through the familiar streets, I rehearsed the scene in my mind. The laughter spilling from the open windows, the smell of fresh paint and polished wood mingling with the scent of candles, the warmth of friends and family congratulating her, all of it, I imagined, would coalesce into a perfect moment. I pictured her standing there in a pale blouse that complemented her hair, her smile wide, her eyes sparkling with delight as she accepted the music box. I could almost hear the soft gasp she would give, that delicate sound she made when surprised and touched simultaneously. I could almost feel the squeeze of her hands around mine, the small tears she often hid behind polite smiles, the quiet gratitude that didn't need words. But the moment I stepped onto her porch, the world shifted. The air seemed to tighten around me, as though the bright summer day had suddenly been enclosed in glass. Allison stood before me, poised yet tense, her face a careful mask that barely contained something I could not name. There was a sharpness in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years, a vigilance, a nervousness that didn't belong to our usual mother-daughter exchanges. She held her hand slightly up, not in greeting, but in a gesture that was both protective and restrictive, as if the doorway itself were a fragile barrier she feared I might cross. "Mom," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the faint hum of conversation behind her. There was a tremor in it, not of fear exactly, but of hesitation, as though she were negotiating with herself what she ought to do, what she must say. Her words, clipped and urgent, struck me like a cold wind. "Take a look from the hallway. My husband didn't invite you." For a moment, the music box felt heavier in my hands. I could not immediately comprehend what she had said. I stared at her, blinking, my own chest tightening with confusion and disbelief. My mind tried to make sense of the words, and the longer I looked at her, the more foreign her posture seemed, the more I felt the invisible wall rising between us. She was my daughter, the girl I had watched grow from a boisterous child into a fiercely independent woman. She had always welcomed me, always laughed at my clumsy jokes, always included me in the milestones that mattered most. And now this, the implication that her husband's preference outweighed the relationship we had nurtured over decades, hit me with a peculiar icy clarity. I took a step closer, almost instinctively, as if my proximity might dissolve the tension, might remind her of the bond that no house or husband could ever sever. But she did not move aside. She did not smile to reassure me. Instead, she folded her hands in front of her, her gaze darting momentarily to the doorway, then back to me. There was an urgency in her eyes that bordered on panic, as if she were silently pleading with me to obey, to retreat. And yet, she did not glance at the small, wrapped box I held, unaware, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the object that carried my love, my memories, my intent to honor her. I stood there on the threshold, the late morning sun casting long shadows across the porch boards, and I felt the strange, hollow pull of exclusion. There was no anger in me yet, only a quiet, stunned disbelief. I could feel the music box's edges pressing into my palm, the ribbon soft but insistent, a reminder that love, once given, could not simply be annulled by circumstance. And in that tension, in that brief, electric pause, I realized that nothing, not distance, not a husband's decree, could erase the history between a mother and her child. I inhaled slowly, the scent of blooming hydrangeas from her garden drifting up to meet me, and in that small, steadying breath, I knew I had to make a choice, to push forward and risk confrontation, or to step back and allow the moment to exist in this strange, suspended silence. Her words froze me. I stood on the threshold, the box heavy in my hands, and for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of exclusion in a way that cut through the years of love I had carefully woven into my relationship with Allison. The music box rested against my hip, the satin ribbon soft beneath my fingers, a small, innocent vessel of memory and devotion. And yet, as I looked at her, the one person I had expected to welcome me, I realized she didn't see it at all. It was as if the gift had become invisible, swallowed by some invisible barrier that neither my intentions nor my decades of maternal care could penetrate. Through the open door, I could hear them, the laughter, the hum of conversation, the unmistakable clink of glasses on polished surfaces. Friends chatted in clusters, toasting Allison's accomplishment, their smiles bright, oblivious to the tension pressing at the doorway. The light from inside spilled across the porch in warm golden streams, illuminating the careful decorations Allison had chosen. Fresh flowers, neatly arranged hors d'oeuvres, and candles flickering like tiny stars. Everything in that room whispered celebration, and yet I was not part of it. I felt like a ghost, a spectator to joy that had suddenly been deemed forbidden. I glanced back at Allison, searching for an explanation in her eyes. But they were taut, unreadable, and I caught the barest trace of hesitation, a flicker of something she could not voice. Her lips were pressed together in a tight line, and her hands were folded so rigidly that it seemed her body had turned into a barricade. Why now? I wanted to ask, though my voice remained trapped somewhere between confusion and disbelief. Why, of all times, when she had just achieved this milestone, was she letting her husband's wishes override the bond we had nurtured for decades? She had always been fiercely independent, and yet this decision, this strange, sudden act of exclusion, did not feel like her at all. I held the box closer to me, feeling its gentle weight, the carved wood warm from my touch, the brass hinge cold under my thumb. My mind began to wander, trying to make sense of the scene, replaying every recent interaction, every phone call, every dinner where Allison might have hinted at discontent, tension, or a subtle fear I had overlooked. Had I missed something in her voice during our last conversation? Was there an argument I didn't know about, a frustration unspoken? The questions swirled in my head, each one sharper than the last, each one gnawing at the fragile calm I was struggling to maintain. I tried to focus on Allison, really focus, looking past the polite posture, the tight smile, the hurried whisper. I searched for the daughter I had raised, the one who had once welcomed me into every triumph and disappointment, the one who had shared secrets over late-night cups of tea and whispered confessions about first loves, heartbreaks, and dreams. I saw her still, in flashes behind the sudden coldness, in the quick, guilty glance she cast toward the party. Something was there, buried beneath the tension, something that made my chest ache. A plea she could not voice aloud, a silent recognition that her mother had always been, and would always be, a constant in her life. Yet the sight of the party itself, bright, warm, unbothered by my absence, only deepened the strange sense of dissonance. The room buzzed with life, filled with people who did not know the quiet history of our family, people whose joy depended on appearances rather than the invisible threads of memory and love. I wondered briefly if the sight of me, a woman in my mid-60s, standing on the edge of the celebration with my gift clutched in my hands, had become a threat. Not a threat in the sense of malice, but in the sense of disruption, an uninvited reminder of a past that Allison's husband perhaps did not wish to acknowledge, a reminder that some things, history, affection, legacy, cannot be wrapped neatly in party favors or small talk. The more I looked, the more questions multiplied. What had changed? What invisible rule had been imposed, and why had Allison allowed it to shape her actions? There was a trembling at the edges of my composure, a rising curiosity that bordered on anxiety. I felt drawn forward, yet restrained by politeness, by love, by a decades-long habit of careful restraint. I wanted to step inside, to place the box in her hands and watch her face light up, to hear the gasp I had imagined countless times during the weeks of preparation. And yet, every instinct screamed that I should respect the boundaries she had drawn, however inexplicable it seemed. The box pressed against my body like a small anchor, a tangible proof of intention, of care, of a love that did not depend on permission. I could almost feel my mother's presence in it, her whispered lessons about generosity and patience, about giving without expectation. I realized then that this small object held far more than music. It held history, memory, and the silent dialogue between generations. And still, Allison's eyes, pleading, refusing, created a tension I could not resolve. The doorway, the hallway, the threshold between inside and outside had become an unspoken battleground. I felt a peculiar mixture of love and frustration, of longing and helplessness, as I clutched the music box and tried to interpret the unsaid reasons behind her decision. For the first time in decades, I felt the strange dislocation of being both intimately connected and entirely excluded, a witness to joy I could not share. I could see her lips pressed together again, a subtle, almost imperceptible sigh, as if she, too, were struggling against something that went beyond simple etiquette or marital rules. And in that moment, the depth of my curiosity, sharp and unrelenting, took root. I had to know, why now, why here, and why had my daughter allowed a wall to rise between us that no words had yet justified? I turned slowly, the music box snug under my arm, the satin ribbon pressing lightly against my side. Each step back from the porch felt like a small surrender, a quiet admission that my presence was unwelcome, that the bond I had assumed unbreakable could, at least temporarily, be overridden. The air was heavy with late morning warmth. the sun sharp against the tips of the hydrangeas lining the walkway. Even the garden seemed complicit in the exclusion, its blooms bright and indifferent, the petals almost mocking in their perfection. I exhaled slowly, trying to summon composure, but the weight in my chest was stubborn, an unyielding pressure that no amount of careful breathing could dissipate. It wasn't just the rebuff. It was the unfamiliar electric shock of watching my daughter, the child I had raised and nurtured, place her loyalty elsewhere, however unconsciously. She had always been kind, thoughtful, fiercely protective of the people she loved. But now, in that quiet whisper at the doorway, she had become something unrecognizable. Her eyes, usually so expressive, so open and warm, had held the sharp edge of obedience to a rule I didn't understand, one I hadn't been part of creating. I called a taxi, the sound of my own voice a fragile tether to reality. It seemed absurd, almost trivial, to summon a car in the midst of such a small, domestic betrayal, yet I needed movement, distance, something tangible to hold on to. The cab would arrive, and I would step inside, placing the music box beside me, my only companion in a sudden exile. My fingers tightened around it, and I felt the familiar grooves in the wood, the tiny brass hinges that clicked softly whenever I shifted my grip. The box had been in my family for decades, a repository of memory and care, and it seemed almost cruelly ironic that this heirloom, the embodiment of thoughtfulness and love, was now a barrier between us. I walked slowly down the path, imagining the party inside, picturing Allison in her perfectly arranged living room, surrounded by friends, glasses raised, laughter spilling over the polished surfaces. I tried to see it through neutral eyes, to detach myself from the sting of exclusion, but the image only sharpened the ache. Every smile I imagined, every animated conversation, was a reminder of my absence, a quiet echo of the connection denied. The music box, tucked close, felt heavier with each step, as if it had absorbed the shock I carried, the sudden, unanticipated grief of being sidelined by someone whose love I had never questioned. I paused briefly at the gate, taking a moment to steady myself. I studied the house one last time, committing every detail to memory, the pale blue shutters Allison had insisted on, the careful arrangement of potted plants on the porch, the glint of sunlight reflecting off the freshly cleaned windows. Everything was perfect, everything gleamed with the accomplishment I had celebrated in my mind for weeks, and yet I was no longer part of it. A bitter twist of disbelief tightened my throat. I wanted to shake her, to demand an explanation, to force the truth from her lips. But even as the thought surged, I knew that such confrontation would only deepen the chasm. So instead, I turned my back and walked away. The taxi's headlights appeared down the street, a small, mundane relief, and I felt a flicker of comfort. The driver waved, and I opened the door, sliding in with deliberate care. The music box rested on my lap, its polished surface warm against my hands, its silent melody a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil inside me. I told the driver the address with a calm I did not feel, trying to ignore the persistent questions twisting in my mind. Why had Allison done this? Why had she let someone else's wishes dictate the treatment of a mother whose love had always been unconditional? Each repetition of the questions only deepened the strange, tight knot forming in my chest. As the car moved away, I imagined the party continuing without me, lights flickering, laughter echoing, conversations flowing seamlessly as if my absence had never mattered. The thought should have stung more than it did, yet beneath the hurt, there was a quiet, almost hypnotic curiosity beginning to stir. Something about Allison's hesitation, the tension in her voice, The hurried glance she gave toward the living room hinted at a reality I had not yet glimpsed, a complexity beyond my understanding. My mind, normally so grounded in routine and memory, began to spin with possibilities, each one sharper, stranger, and more urgent than the last. I clenched my hands around the box and leaned back in the seat, letting the city blur past the windows. The weight of the music box was comforting and strange, a physical anchor to the life and love I carried, even as the evening I had imagined, bright, warm, celebratory, slipped further from reach. I did not yet know that the true shock, the one that would ripple through the house, through Allison's carefully ordered life, and even through my own expectations, was quietly waiting behind the closed doors I had just left. For now I had only the hum of the taxi, the steady pulse of the tires on asphalt, and the pressing, unanswerable questions that had settled heavily on my chest. And yet, in that wait, in that quiet, suspended disbelief, I felt the first tremors of something I could not name, an intuition that the night would unfold in ways far stranger than I could imagine, that the gift in my arms, the music box, would somehow shift the world I thought I knew irreversibly. Later that evening, the phone rang. I was folding laundry in the quiet of my living room when I saw Allison's name flashing across the screen. My chest tightened, not from anticipation, but from an uneasy foreboding that had been growing ever since I left her doorstep. The moment I heard her voice, all that tension crystallized into a tangible force. "Mom, you won't believe what happened," she said, her voice trembling in a way that made my stomach twist into knots. It wasn't the tone of someone angry at me, though I had half expected that, half expected her to scold me for leaving without insisting on my presence. But it was something sharper, almost panicked, and it carried a weight that made the room feel suddenly smaller, tighter, the walls closing in with invisible hands. "What happened?" I asked, gripping the phone so tightly that the cord pressed into my palm. My own voice sounded steadier than I felt, though inside, a storm was building, a mixture of fear, confusion, and a rising fiery indignation. "Allison's husband, he found out about your gift. That music box you brought." Her words cut off, unfinished, as though the very act of speaking them aloud threatened to unravel something delicate and volatile. My mind, already racing, began to fill in the blanks. The polished wood, the antique carvings, the small brass hinges glinting softly in the afternoon sun, all somehow becoming instruments of confrontation in a house I had been denied. I pressed the phone closer, straining to hear, though the tremor in her voice was already shaping the contours of the story. "What do you mean he found out? He saw it? Opened it?" The questions tumbled out of me, sharp and impatient, each one a desperate bid to make sense of what was rapidly becoming incomprehensible. Allison swallowed audibly over the line, and I could almost picture her pacing, the dim lighting of her living room casting shifting shadows across her features. He saw it," she whispered finally. He couldn't believe it. Mom, he packed his things. He left. Tonight." For a moment, the words hung in the air, each one striking like a hammer blow. My heart skipped, then thudded, then raced. I pressed my free hand to my forehead, trying to steady the sudden rush of emotion, trying to calm the surge of disbelief that threatened to overtake me entirely. Allison's husband, my son-in-law, the man I had met only a handful of times and had tried to welcome into the family, had reacted like this to a gift? A music box, a symbol, small and tender, meant to honor a new beginning, had somehow detonated into chaos, shattering an entire evening, perhaps more. Anger rose inside me, sudden, fierce, and uncontainable. Not just anger at him, though he was certainly a target, but at the entire situation, at the injustice of it, at the absurdity that a gesture of love could provoke fear, suspicion, and a man's abrupt abandonment. I could feel heat climbing from my chest to my temples, my pulse drumming a furious rhythm. How could something so delicate, so rooted in family and memory, inspire such destruction? How could Allison's judgment, or perhaps her fear of confrontation, allow him to wield my gift as a weapon against her own life, and against the celebration we had so carefully imagined together? Why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you say something? I demanded, my voice shaking despite my attempt at control. I wanted to speak firmly, to channel the anger into a protective maternal force, to shield my daughter from this inexplicable whirlwind. The anger wasn't only mine. It belonged to all the quiet evenings spent crafting the gift, all the thought poured into each delicate detail, all the love embedded into the wood and brass of that music box. I tried, Allison said, her voice barely above a whisper, almost drowned by the tremor of despair beneath it. But he didn't listen. He just, she trailed off, leaving the sentence incomplete, but I didn't need the words. The imagery was vivid enough. A man ignoring reason, tossing aside decades of familial love, acting on impulse, on some undefined fear of sentimentality. I could feel my blood warming, a controlled fury that demanded attention, demanded acknowledgement, demanded justice, not for me, though part of it was, but for the sheer absurdity of what had just unfolded. I sank into my armchair, gripping the phone and the invisible edges of my anger simultaneously, my mind whirling through the possibilities. My gift, meant to honor memory and connection, had become a catalyst for discord, and I could feel the raw unfairness of it clawing at me. I pictured Allison, alone in the suddenly too large house, the echo of her husband's footsteps gone, the party forgotten, the celebratory air replaced by tension so sharp it must have left her breathless. And through it all, the music box remained, silent, unjudged, innocent, yet somehow accused, somehow implicated in the rupture. I realized then that the anger I felt was more than fury at the moment. It was a fierce, protective, almost primal instinct. It was the kind of anger that rises when a parent sees their child hurt, when something tender, something crafted with love, is twisted into a weapon in someone else's hands. And it was unstoppable, burning a line through every thought, every calculation, leaving only a raw, relentless pulse of indignation that refused to be quieted. I could hear her gasp, hear the tremor in her voice as she struggled to speak. He packed his things, Mom. He left. Tonight. The words slammed into me with a force that made my stomach drop. I froze mid-step, phone pressed tightly to my ear, the laundry I had been folding now forgotten in my lap. A music box. Something delicate, something meant to honor and celebrate, a gift from my heart, had triggered an unraveling so immediate, so complete, that I could scarcely comprehend it. My chest tightened as an icy knot of fear rooted itself deep within me, spreading outward with every rapid heartbeat. Fear isn't always sudden. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, building on small anxieties until it becomes unbearable. But this, it hit me fully, a blinding wave that left me breathless. My daughter, Allison, the person I had loved and protected since the day she was born, was now alone in a house that had been meant to be her sanctuary, her triumph. The thought of her sitting amidst polished furniture, the gleam of freshly painted walls, the very symbol of her hard work and accomplishment, and finding it hollow and quiet in the wake of betrayal and sudden absence, My heart ached so sharply it felt as if I might collapse. I gripped the phone tighter, knuckles white, and leaned back into the armchair. The world outside my window, the familiar hum of the evening traffic, the soft glow of streetlights, all seemed distant, irrelevant. My focus was entirely on her, on the fear I could hear dripping from every syllable of her voice. Fear for Allison, not for myself, though the thought that my gift, a piece of my own family's history, could precipitate such devastation twisted sharply in my chest. It wasn't guilt exactly, it was terror. The terror of imagining the worst, of picturing her fragile heart caught in a moment of confusion and isolation, of feeling utterly powerless to intervene. "Mom, I don't know what to do," she whispered, voice trembling so violently that it sounded as if she might collapse into tears at any second. I could hear the faint scraping of something being moved, maybe a suitcase, maybe her own hands wringing together. Every sound she made magnified my fear, like splintering glass vibrating through the quiet spaces of the line connecting us. I tried to steady myself, tried to think rationally, but fear is not rational. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Allison alone, crying in her pristine living room, the echo of her husband's absence stretching through the house, through her chest, leaving a hollow emptiness where laughter and celebration should have been. The music box, still carefully wrapped, its innocent brass hinges silent witnesses to a calamity they had not caused but had somehow become entwined with. I imagined her pacing, restless, unable to reconcile the sudden void with the joy she had anticipated, with the plans she had made for the evening. My pulse quickened, each beat a drum of alarm that seemed too loud, too insistent. "Breathe, Allison," I said finally, my own voice trembling even as I tried to steady her, even as I tried to steady myself. "I'm here. You're not alone." The words sounded inadequate even as they left my lips. I wanted to leap through the phone line, to take her in my arms and hold her close, to protect her from the cascading shock that had stolen her night, her celebration, her sense of safety. But of course I couldn't. My body, my heart, my hands, none of it could reach her beyond the fragile signal connecting us. Fear is peculiar in that it magnifies every detail. I could hear the subtle inflections in her voice, the pauses where she was barely holding herself together, the tiny sighs that spoke of disbelief and rising panic. I pictured her alone on the sofa, the music box unopened beside her, the ribbon still intact, a symbol of everything that should have been tender, harmonious, celebratory, and now a catalyst of disruption. My chest constricted further, a hand unconsciously moving to cover it as if sheer touch could protect the invisible wound inflicted by circumstance. I could not calm myself. I could not make sense of the situation, and that inability fueled the fear. What if she was hurt beyond the sting of a sudden abandonment? What if this moment, fleeting and chaotic as it was, left a scar in her trust, her heart, her sense of home? Every imagined detail of her solitude in that house, the gleam of polished floors, the neatness of a room now empty of warmth, suffused me with dread. I could not shake the image of her frozen in disbelief, hands clutching the air, tears threatening to spill, and my helplessness was excruciating. And yet, beneath the fear, a faint, almost imperceptible pulse of determination began to form. I might be far away, but I was her mother. I would not let fear paralyze me entirely. I could not undo the night, nor predict its immediate resolution, but I could be her anchor, the voice of steadiness, the hand she could grasp even if only through the fragile wire of a phone line. The terror remained, a coiled, restless weight in my chest, but it was tempered, for the first time since the call began, by the certainty that I would not abandon her, that I would not let her face this alone. I held the phone like a lifeline, my knuckles white, as Allison's voice trembled across the line, yet somehow carried the clarity of revelation. "Mom, it wasn't the music box," she said, taking a shaky breath. "It was everything that it revealed." I paused, instinctively clutching the wrapped gift closer to my chest, as if its delicate wood and brass might somehow absorb the tension I felt thrumming through the line. "What do you mean, Allison?" I asked, though part of me already feared the answer. My heart pounded, not with fear or anger, but with the jagged edges of anticipation, the kind that slices through reason and leaves you raw, exposed. Her words spilled forth, hesitant at first, then faster, driven by a mixture of shock and relief. "He's been lying, Mom. About money. About debts. Gambling debts. He told me he was saving, investing, even borrowing carefully to support his career. But the music box," she trailed off, her voice catching, fragile as spun glass. "He saw its appraisal online, the value, and it hit him. Everything he's been hiding, everything he's been lying about, came into sharp focus. He couldn't face it. He couldn't face me. Not with the truth staring him in the face." I could feel my stomach knotting tighter with every word, a mixture of incredulity, fear, and a strange, reluctant vindication. The music box, a relic of my own mother's careful, loving hands, had become the instrument of exposure, but not because it was malicious or intrusive. Its worth, its rarity, was enough to reveal the cracks that had existed quietly, like hairline fractures in glass, hidden until the pressure was applied. I imagined the moment he realized that all his lies were exposed in a single instant, the weight of them pressing down like a physical force, suffocating and relentless. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to absorb it all. Allison continued, her words slower now, colored by awe and disbelief. "He always criticized gifts from family, Mom. Said they were too expensive, too personal, too suspicious. I thought it was just his personality, a stubborn streak. But the truth, he's been hiding more than I could ever imagine. And the music box, it was priceless, not just in money but in history and sentiment. And when he realized what it was, he couldn't handle the reality he'd created for himself." I sank back into my armchair, my mind racing through the consequences, the subtle signs I had missed over the years. How many evenings had I spent observing their interactions, the tension hidden beneath polite smiles, the faint frustration Allison often excused with a laugh? How often had I suspected something was off, something small, something I couldn't put my finger on? And yet, I had never imagined that a simple gift, chosen with love and care, could act as the catalyst for clarity, for truth, for the collapse of pretense. "Mom," Allison's voice softened, fragile but tinged with a new understanding. "It wasn't your fault, not your gift. It was him. It was the secrets he carried, the lies he spun. Your music box, it just made the truth impossible to ignore." The anger I had felt earlier, the heat that had pulsed through me when imagining her alone, began to shift into a more complex, layered emotion. Relief, yes, but tinged with awe and astonishment at the unexpected power of honesty. I felt a cautious pride, too, not for causing disruption, but for participating, however unknowingly, in a moment of unmasking, in a revelation that, while painful, carried the possibility of clarity and renewal. The music box, a fragile carrier of memory and sentiment, had performed its silent, dignified duty, revealing the fault lines not through coercion or force, but through truth. I pictured Allison in the quiet of her living room, the house still echoing with the remnants of the evening, the music box sitting unopened, pristine, its ribbon intact, holding the weight of history, sentiment, and now truth. Her husband, gone, left to confront himself, to reckon with the consequences of deception and avoidance. And Allison, my daughter, standing on the threshold of honesty, of awareness, of a painful clarity she had not asked for but now possessed. I closed my eyes, letting the relief wash over me, mingled with the tremors of fear and the lingering pulse of anger that had accompanied the evening. The music box had not broken anything. It had illuminated everything. It had forced truth into the light, and in that illumination, I could finally see the contours of reality, stark and undeniable. For the first time since stepping onto her porch that afternoon, I felt the sharp edges of fear soften, replaced by a clarity I hadn't expected. The chaos of the evening, the anger, the panic, all began to make sense. Not through blame, not through judgment, but through truth. The hard, luminous truth that sometimes the smallest gestures, crafted with love and care, can become instruments of revelation beyond imagination. I held the phone to my chest long after Allison's voice had faded, as if keeping her warmth close could anchor me in the swirl of emotions that had overtaken the evening. Tears rolled down my cheeks, unbidden but honest, carving paths through the lines of years spent worrying, loving, and watching her grow. I whispered her name, over and over, as if speaking it aloud could remind the universe that she was safe, intact, still whole, even when the world, or at least her world, had seemed to collapse in an instant. It was strange, the way peace arrived, not with fanfare, not in triumphant declarations, but quietly, almost imperceptibly, threading through the cracks left by panic, anger, and fear. The disaster of the night still lingered in the corners of my mind. The rejection at the doorstep, the sharp sting of Allison's nervous eyes, the surreal knowledge that a single gift, chosen with love, had been the pivot upon which truth spun so violently into her life. And yet, in that quiet acceptance, I found something I hadn't expected: relief. Relief that she had been spared a lifetime of deception. Relief that honesty, no matter how harsh, had found its way to her. I pictured her the next morning, sunlight spilling over the counters, her hair tousled from a restless sleep, her eyes clear now, steady with the knowledge that the world was not as she had believed, but that she could still navigate it, unafraid. And there, on her kitchen counter, sat the music box, the delicate wood polished to a warm glow, the brass inlay catching the light in a modest, dignified sparkle. It hummed faintly, the gentle notes spilling into the air like a whisper, a quiet reassurance. The same music box that had belonged to my mother, that had survived decades of care, of loving hands passing it from generation to generation, now bore witness to something far larger than itself, the illumination of truth and the preservation of my daughter's integrity. I thought of the irony, how a simple object could hold such weight, could carry the gravity of a night that might have been defined by loss, humiliation, or despair. Instead, it had acted as a fulcrum, tipping the scales toward clarity. I had intended it as a gesture of love, a symbol of continuity, a way to celebrate a new chapter in Allison's life. I had never imagined that it would reveal what lay hidden, unspoken, festering beneath the veneer of comfort and routine. And yet it had, not by malice, not by accident, but simply by existing as it was, genuine, honest, unaltered, a small piece of history that refused to be ignored. I exhaled, slow and deliberate, letting the air carry away the last of my tension. There was no need to dwell on what had shattered or what had been revealed. Instead, I allowed myself to linger on what had been preserved. My daughter's courage, her resilience, the untainted core of her heart, remained intact. She would face the aftermath, yes, but she would do so as herself, not as someone compromised by deceit, not as someone trapped in a house built on lies. The music box had safeguarded more than memory. It had safeguarded her sense of self. And in that understanding, I felt peace. A quiet, deep peace that settled into my bones and reminded me gently that love, true, unwavering, and honest love, was a force that could outlast rejection, fear, and even betrayal. I could still hear Allison's voice, soft and relieved, threaded with emotion and clarity. I imagined her touching the music box, her fingers tracing the curves, the inlaid brass, feeling the weight of its history, and unknowingly, the weight of truth it had carried for her. It struck me then how small gestures, simple acts of care, could ripple outward in ways we cannot anticipate. I had only intended to celebrate her home, to honor a milestone. And yet, the ripple had touched something far deeper, something essential. The night had tested us, shaken us, and yet, here we were, still standing, still connected, still able to breathe freely. I smiled, a quiet, full smile that carried all the relief, the sorrow, the love, and the understanding of the evening. I whispered a prayer of gratitude for my daughter, for the music box, for the unexpected ways life sometimes unfolds. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to let go completely of fear, of anger, of uncertainty. All that remained was the enduring sense of love, a love that had been tested and had emerged not unscathed, but unbroken, wiser, and all the more precious for its survival. The music box would sit there, humming its gentle tune, a quiet sentinel over the new chapter of Allison's life. And in its song, I found my own quiet song of acceptance, an acknowledgement that love, honesty, and courage could coexist, could endure, and could, ultimately, heal.